My name is Kendra Vance. I am 22 years old. And on the night of my college graduation dinner, my mother leaned across a table covered in crystal and white linen and demanded I hide my own grandmother. We were sitting in the center of the most exclusive dining room in Potomac, Maryland. The air smelled like roasted bone marrow and expensive truffle oil. Instead of handing me a menu to celebrate my degree in software engineering, my mother, Patricia, gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. Her eyes darted toward the mahogany entrance doors. She pitched her voice into that frantic, breathless whisper people use when they are terrified of losing their social standing. "Kendra," she hissed, "go speak to the hostess. Tell them we need the private alcove near the kitchen doors right now." I looked at her. "We booked this table 3 weeks ago. Victor Caldwell dines here on Fridays," she said, her gaze fixed on the host stand in the distance. "If the CEO of my firm walks through those doors and sees her sitting with us," she flicked her eyes toward the empty chair on my left. My grandmother Helen had gone to the restroom to wash her hands. "She is your mother," I said, keeping my voice flat. "She is a retired cleaning lady." Patricia shot back the polished veneer of her country club life, cracking open to reveal the panic underneath. "Look at her hands, Kendra. Look at that worn-out thrift store coat. She embarrasses us." My father, Richard, adjusted his silk tie and studied the ice in his cocktail glass. He always found his drink fascinating whenever Patricia went on the offensive. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I just sat there tracing the rim of my water glass, calculating the exact social deficit my parents operated under. Welcome back to Fluffy Revenge, where the loudest people in the room finally meet the quietest consequences. If you appreciate watching a house of cards fold under its own weight, drop a comment telling me your age and hit the subscribe button because this story is going to require your full attention. Let me take you back to the beginning of the dinner and explain exactly why my mother was sweating through her designer dress. To understand my family, you need to understand Maryland. We live in a state split down the middle by invisible lines. Down in Baltimore, where my grandmother Helen spent 35 years, scrubbing commercial office floors on the night shift people value sweat and worn in work boots. Up here in the manicured suburbs of Bethesda and Potomac, status is a blood sport. You are only as good as the zip code on your mail and the logo on your leased car. Patricia and Richard are professional climbers. They lease a luxury SUV they struggle to insure, maintain a country club membership they use solely for photographs, and for the last 4 years, they have treated me like their unpaid administrative assistant. While they attended galas, I worked double shifts at the campus tech help desk to graduate debt-free. I reset their passwords, filed their tax extensions, and managed their digital banking. I was the family firewall. Helen returned to this table. She walked with a slight limp, her posture straight, wearing a navy wool coat that had seen a decade of brutal winters. She took her seat. Patricia stiffened. She leaned away as if poverty were a disease you could catch by sitting too close. She shot me a glare that clearly meant fix this. I watched Helen pick up her cloth napkin. My grandmother caught Patricia's glare. She heard the heavy, suffocating silence hanging over the crystal glasses. Helen did not look down. She did not shrink into her chair. She looked at her daughter, then at me, and offered a quiet, unbothered smile. It was the smile of a woman holding a winning hand in a game nobody else knew they were playing. I reached for my menu. The dinner had just started, but I already knew my parents were running out of time. To understand why my grandmother smiled instead of shrinking under my mother's glare, you have to look backward. You have to step out of that Potomac dining room and travel 40 miles north to a narrow brick row house in Baltimore. That house belonged to Helen. It was the place where I actually grew up. While Patricia spent my childhood attending silent auctions and networking at corporate galas, Helen was the one making sure I ate dinner and finished my spelling homework. Helen spent 35 years working the night shift. She cleaned commercial office buildings in downtown Washington, taking the commuter train long after the sun went down. She emptied the trash cans of executives. She scrubbed the marble lobby floors until they reflected the security lights. She wiped down conference tables where people like my parents sat during the day to discuss profit margins. Every morning right around dawn, I would hear the front door of the row house click shut. Helen would walk into the kitchen, her uniform smelling sharp and metallic, a mix of industrial bleach and the winter air. But when she hugged me before I left for school, she always smelled like the peppermint candies she kept in her coat pocket. That combination, bleach and peppermint, became my definition of safety. Patricia viewed the Baltimore row house as a temporary blemish on her resume. She wanted to erase where she came from. She wanted to erase the fact that her college tuition was paid for by the sweat of a woman holding a mop. The moment Patricia secured a junior position at a defense contracting firm, she packed her bags, married Richard, and moved to Bethesda. I was born a few years later, an inconvenient accessory to their climbing social calendar. When they realized raising a child required time, they preferred to spend rubbing elbows with local politicians. They dropped me off at Helen's house. They framed it as a favor to an empty nester. It was not a favor. It was outsourcing. By the time I entered college to study cybersecurity, I understood that I was on my own financially. My parents were too busy curating their affluent image to contribute to my tuition. So I built my own infrastructure. I worked double shifts at the university technology help desk. I spent my nights resetting forgotten passwords for tenured professors and troubleshooting corrupted hard drives for frantic freshmen. My reality was fluorescent lighting, cold coffee, and the constant hum of server racks. I structured my life with military precision because I refused to graduate chained to high-interest student loans. Every paycheck went to tuition, rent, and textbooks. Then there was Derek, my older brother by 4 years. In the grand ecosystem of the Vance family, Derek was the apex predator, though he possessed the actual survival skills of a houseplant. Derek is the golden child. While I was debugging code at 2 a.m, Derek was busy launching his third failed startup company. His first venture was a premium dog walking application that ran out of funds in 6 months. His second was a subscription box service for artisanal shoelaces. Currently, he is the self-proclaimed chief executive officer of a vague consulting agency that produces nothing but buzzwords and expensive lunch receipts. Derek does not work double shifts. Derek does not worry about rent. Patricia and Richard fund his lifestyle entirely. They cover the lease on his luxury Arlington apartment. They pay the insurance on his imported sports car. They write him seed money checks under the guise of investing in a visionary entrepreneur. At our last Thanksgiving dinner, I sat at the table eating dry turkey while Derek pitched a new algorithm he had not even built yet. My father nodded seriously, pulled out his checkbook, and wrote a 5-figure sum right there next to the gravy boat. When I asked for $50 a week later to cover a textbook I needed for my final project, Patricia sighed, told me money was tight, and suggested I pick up a third shift at the help desk. That is the family arithmetic. It is a rigid mathematical formula that governs our lives. Resources flow uphill to Derek. Obligations, chores, and emotional labor flow downhill to me. My parents view my competence not as a source of pride, but as a public utility they can tap into whenever they experience a minor inconvenience. I am expected to handle their digital lives without a single word of thanks. When my father backed his leased SUV into a mailbox, I was the one who had to navigate the insurance portal, upload the photos, and file the claim because the website was supposedly too confusing. When my mother needed to sync her cloud storage across her new tablet phone and laptop before a big presentation, she summoned me to Potomac on a Sunday morning. I spent 4 hours migrating her data while she drank mimosas on the patio. In my line of work, we study how networks are compromised. We look at firewalls, encryption protocols, and malware. But the most common way a system gets breached is not through a sophisticated line of malicious code. It happens through social engineering. Social engineering is the psychological manipulation of people into performing actions or divulging confidential information. It is the art of weaponizing human nature. When I look at my family through a professional lens, I do not see complicated emotional dynamics. I see a continuous social engineering attack. My parents run a lifelong phishing scam on my conscience. They use guilt-subtle threats of exclusion and weaponized incompetence to trick me into handing over my most valuable assets, which are my time, my energy, and my peace of mind. Patricia will send a text saying she is overwhelmed, hinting at a panic attack over a disorganized tax spreadsheet. The emotional hook is set. She knows I will log in, organize her deductions, and generate the report just to stop the incoming crisis. It is a brilliant, highly effective hack. They extract my labor for free by exploiting the one vulnerability in my operating system. I care. Let me give you a specific example of this family arithmetic in action. Last winter, Helen needed a new winter coat. Her old navy one was fraying at the cuffs, and the zipper had a habit of separating at the bottom. I found a sturdy insulated coat online and asked my parents to split the cost with me as a Christmas gift for her. It was a modest request, perhaps $80 each. Patricia called me back within the hour. She used her soft, reasonable voice, the one that always precedes a rejection. "Kendra, sweetheart," she said, Derek is going through a vital transition phase with his company right now. We just covered his branding retreat in Aspen. We really need to tighten our belts this quarter. You are so good at finding bargains. Why do not you check the local thrift stores for your grandmother? She does not care about brand names anyway. I ended the call. I did not argue. Arguing with Patricia is like trying to patch a leaking pipe with tissue paper. I took an extra weekend shift at the help desk, worked 16 hours straight, and bought Helen the coat myself. When Christmas arrived, Patricia handed Helen a cheap box of drugstore chocolates and spent 20 minutes complaining about the high cost of premium wrapping paper. Derek gifted Helen a promotional t-shirt featuring the logo of his failed shoelace company. Helen smiled, thanked them both, and put on the coat I bought her. She knew exactly who had provided the warmth and who had provided the empty gestures. That is why Helen sat so still at the graduation dinner. She had spent a lifetime observing the hollow center of Patricia's social climbing. She knew that my parents projected an image of effortless wealth, but underneath the tailored suits and the country club smiles, they were constantly frantic, constantly scrambling to keep the illusion alive. I thought I understood the full extent of their manipulation. I thought the worst they could do was steal my time and demand my free labor. I accepted the family arithmetic because it was easier than fighting a war I could not win. I treated their demands like routine maintenance, a tax I had to pay to keep the peace. But peace in the Vance family is an illusion. It is a temporary ceasefire that only lasts until the next bill comes due. I did not know it yet, but my parents had escalated their social engineering attack. They had found a way to extract more than just my time. They had found a way to extract my future. The realization did not happen during an argument. It did not happen with a dramatic confession. It happened quietly in the sterile glow of a computer monitor 3 weeks before that dinner in Potomac. I had been sitting at my desk running a routine background check required for my new government security clearance. I typed in my social security number, hit enter, and watched the digital architecture of my life load onto the screen. What I saw in those data logs would fundamentally alter the structure of my family forever, and it would explain exactly why my mother was so terrified of letting a cleaning lady sit at the main table. 3 weeks before that suffocating dinner in Potomac, the truth arrived, not with a shout, but with the quiet hum of a cooling fan inside my laptop. It was 2 a.m. I sat alone at the campus help desk, the fluorescent overhead lights buzzing a steady rhythm against the dark windows. My graduation was fast approaching, and with it came the final hurdle for my new position as a software engineer. The defense firm required a high-level government security clearance. In my industry, a compromised financial history is the ultimate vulnerability. Debt makes you a liability. Debt makes you susceptible to bribery and leverage. I had spent 4 years eating cheap ramen and working double shifts specifically to ensure my record remained pristine. I logged into the federal background check portal. The interface prompted me to pull a comprehensive credit report to verify my standing. I clicked the button expecting to see a blank slate, Perhaps just my modest monthly phone bill and the small student checking account I managed with careful precision. The screen refreshed. A progress bar crawled across the monitor. Then the data populated. My credit score wasn't pristine. It was bleeding. There was an active revolving credit account attached to my Social Security number. It was a platinum tier card, the kind issued to high earners, opened exactly 4 weeks after my 18th birthday. The current balance read $14,212. My initial reaction was biological. The blood drained from my face, pooling somewhere in my stomach. A cold sweat prickled along my hairline. $14,000. To a college student surviving on hourly wages, that number isn't just a debt. It is a prison sentence. My mind immediately jumped to identity theft. I assumed a faceless hacker in a remote server farm had stolen my credentials in a corporate data breach. My training took over. Panic is a useless emotion in software engineering and security. You don't cry over a breach. You isolate the compromised network. You trace the intrusion. You gather the logs. I opened a secure terminal and began pulling the transaction history. I needed to see where the money was going. If this were a standard digital heist, the purchases would be anonymous gift cards, cryptocurrency transfers, or high-end electronics shipped to drop houses. Instead, the merchant names appearing on my screen felt strangely familiar. There was a charge for $800 at a boutique in downtown Bethesda. I remembered Patricia wearing a silk blouse from that exact store to a charity luncheon last month. There was a recurring monthly charge of $400 for dues at the Potomac Country Club. I remembered Richard complaining about the slow service on the golf course just 2 weeks ago. There was a dining charge for $300 at the exact French restaurant where we were scheduled to have my upcoming graduation dinner. The final heaviest blow was a single transaction from 3 years ago. $5,000 processed at a luxury car dealership in Arlington. It was the exact down payment Derek needed to secure the lease on his imported BMW. I stopped typing. The campus help desk was dead silent. I stared at the glowing pixels until they blurred together. A faceless hacker hadn't stolen my identity. The call was coming from inside the house. My parents had waited until I was legally an adult, taken my Social Security number, and forged my signature to open a line of credit they couldn't secure themselves. They had tethered my clean name to their sinking ship to buy themselves time. They used my future to finance their present. Every time Patricia bragged about Derek's entrepreneurial spirit, every time she polished her country club image, she was doing it on my dime. They weren't wealthy. They were drowning in a fragile house of cards, and they had quietly decided to let me drown with them. A normal daughter might have picked up the phone. A normal daughter might have called her parents, screaming into the receiver, demanding explanations in tears. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't shed a single tear. The cold clinical detachment of my profession wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. They had treated my life as a resource to be mined. I would treat their crime as an active investigation. I began the forensic documentation. I needed irrefutable proof, a chain of evidence so clean that no lawyer could ever dismiss it. I bypassed the standard consumer portal and used the underlying metadata of the digital statements to track the login history. I pulled the IP addresses associated with every online payment made to the account over the last 4 years. The addresses resolved to a residential internet service provider in Potomac. They matched the exact static IP of the router I had personally configured for my parents' home network. I cataloged the routing numbers used to make the minimum monthly payments. They led straight to Richard's primary checking account. I took screenshots of every single page. I mapped the dates of the boutique purchases to Patricia's public social media posts, matching the timestamp of the transaction to photographs of her wearing the stolen merchandise. The digital footprint was arrogant, sloppy, and entirely devastating. I gathered all of this raw data and organized it into a structured incident report. I named the file Incident 0. I placed the documents, the IP logs, the cross-referenced photographs, and the financial statements into a secure folder. I encrypted the folder using a military-grade algorithm. I uploaded the encrypted dossier to an offshore cloud server, ensuring that even if my physical devices were compromised, the evidence would remain untouchable. Sitting in the dark, I reviewed the family arithmetic one last time. I thought about Helen scrubbing floors for 35 years to build a foundation her daughter eagerly abandoned. I thought about Patricia sneering at thrift store coats while wearing stolen silk. My parents were frauds. Their elite Potomac lifestyle was a hollow performance subsidized by the unauthorized exploitation of their own child. They believed my competence made me useful. They forgot that my competence also made me dangerous. I closed my laptop. The hum of the cooling fan slowed to a stop. I knew I had to resolve this credit issue before my security clearance review concluded. But a simple fraud report to the bank would trigger a police investigation prematurely. I needed to control the blast radius. I needed to leverage this information on my own terms, in a setting where they couldn't spin the narrative or hang up the phone. I needed an audience. That realization brought me right back to the graduation dinner. It brought me to the starched white linen, the smell of roasted bone marrow, and the desperate, frantic whisper of a mother trying to hide her working-class roots from a room full of strangers. Patricia thought she was managing a social crisis. She had no idea she was sitting across from an auditor who had already reviewed her ledger and found it severely overdrawn. As I sat at the table in the present moment listening to Patricia hiss about the CEO of her company, the weight of the encrypted dossier in my digital cloud felt like a loaded weapon. The time for silent compliance was over. The waiter arrived with the appetizer plates, oblivious to the suffocating tension anchoring our table. He set down a delicate arrangement of seared scallops, offered a polite bow, and vanished back into the bustling dining room. Patricia did not even look at her food. Her attention remained locked on the mahogany entrance doors, her posture rigid, her breathing shallow. The Potomac restaurant was operating at peak Friday night capacity. Wealthy patrons filled the booths negotiating corporate mergers over expensive wine, their voices blending into a steady, privileged hum. For my mother, this was not a dining experience. This was a tactical battlefield. She was currently a senior director at her defense contracting firm, and a vice president position had recently opened. In her mind, securing that promotion required projecting a flawless aristocratic image. She believed corporate America only promoted people who looked like they were born in a country club. She had spent a decade erasing her Baltimore roots, burying the truth of her working-class upbringing under a mountain of leased European cars and designer handbags. And sitting right next to me wearing a faded navy wool coat and a simple cotton dress purchased from a clearance rack was the living, breathing contradiction to Patricia's carefully curated lie. Helen took a slow sip of her water, her calloused hands resting gently on the white linen tablecloth. Those hands had scrubbed miles of commercial tile, enduring harsh chemicals to put food on the table when Patricia was a teenager. Now, Patricia looked at those hands with naked disgust. Kendra. Patricia hissed, leaning across the table again. Her perfume, something heavy and floral, clashed with the scent of the roasted marrow. I am not asking you. I am telling you. Get the hostess. We are moving to the private alcove. Victor Caldwell frequents this establishment. He is the chief executive officer of my firm. If he walks in here and sees me sitting with a woman who looks like she just finished mopping the kitchen floors, my promotion is dead. Richard cleared his throat, taking a long, deliberate swallow of his bourbon. Let us just keep the peace, Patricia, he muttered, though he made no move to defend his mother-in-law. He was the eternal bystander, happy to enjoy the spoils of Patricia's social climbing without ever getting his hands dirty. Patricia ignored him. She reached across the table and grabbed Helen by the wrist. Her manicured nails dug into the frayed cuff of Helen's coat. Mom, stand up. Patricia ordered, her voice trembling with a toxic mixture of shame and panic. You are going to walk to the back hallway, and you are going to wait there while Kendra secures us a hidden booth. You are a liability right now. You cannot sit here looking like that. Helen did not resist the physical pull, but she did not stand either. She looked at her daughter's hand, then raised her eyes to meet Patricia's frantic gaze. Helen possessed a deep, unshakable dignity. She knew exactly what she was worth, and she knew exactly how little her daughter valued her. I felt the familiar clinical coldness wash over me. The cybersecurity training kicked in. You do not negotiate with a hostile threat. You establish a perimeter and you enforce it. I reached across the table and placed my hand firmly over Patricia's wrist, forcing her to let go of my grandmother. Patricia snapped her head toward me, her eyes wide with shock at the physical intervention. She stays right here or I leave. I delivered the words in a flat, load-bearing voice. I did not raise my pitch. I did not inject an ounce of anger into the sentence. It was a simple, immovable fact. Patricia recoiled, rubbing her wrist as if I had burned her. You would walk out on your own college graduation dinner. You would cause a scene in front of half of Bethesda. I will walk out that door right now, I replied calmly. And I will take Helen with me. You can explain to your chief executive officer why you are sitting alone at a table set for 4. The threat of public embarrassment is the only currency my parents truly respect. Patricia's face flushed a deep mottled red. The veins in her neck became visible. She realized she could not force Helen to move without causing the exact spectacle she was trying to avoid. But a narcissist losing control always pivots to their secondary weapon. She abandoned the physical aggression and launched the emotional blackmail. I cannot believe you are doing this to me, Patricia whispered, her eyes shining with sudden manufactured tears. After all the sacrifices we made for you. We gave you a beautiful life, Kendra. We brought you to this incredibly expensive restaurant to celebrate your achievements, and you repay us with defiance. You are so ungrateful. You have no idea the pressure I am under. You have no idea what it takes to survive in my world. She was running the script. It was the same social engineering attack she had used for my entire life. The goal was to make me feel small, to make me feel indebted, to force me into compliance through a manufactured sense of guilt. Yesterday, that script might have worked. Yesterday, I might have lowered my eyes, apologized, and escorted my grandmother to the back of the restaurant to keep the peace. But yesterday, I did not know about the $14,000 of fraudulent debt attached to my social security number. I opened my purse. I bypassed my phone and my wallet, reaching into the hidden side pocket. My fingers brushed against a neatly folded piece of printer paper. Before leaving my apartment, I had printed a single page from the encrypted dossier. It was the latest billing statement for the Platinum credit card, clearly displaying my name, the staggering balance, and the itemized charges from the Potomac Country Club and the luxury boutiques. I pulled the folded paper out. I kept it low, shielding it from the view of the surrounding tables. I leaned forward, matching my mother's proximity. I slid the paper face down across the starched white linen, slipping it directly under the base of Patricia's crystal water glass. Patricia stopped her monologue mid-sentence. She frowned, confused by the sudden movement. "What is that?" she asked, her tone shifting from victimhood to irritation. "It is a receipt," I said softly. "I have not even asked for the check yet," Richard interjected, setting his bourbon glass down with a heavy thud. "It is not from the restaurant," I clarified, keeping my eyes locked on my mother. "Go ahead, Mom. Take a look at your sacrifices." Patricia eyed me suspiciously. She reached out, pinched the edge of the folded paper, and slid it out from beneath her glass. She opened it using both hands. I watched her eyes track across the page. I watched her read the bank logo at the top left corner. I watched her register my full legal name printed in bold ink. I watched her eyes drop to the current balance section. The biological response was immediate and severe. The flush of anger vanished from Patricia's cheeks, replaced by a pale, sickly gray. Her lips parted slightly. The paper trembled in her hands, rustling against the edge of the table. She looked up at me, her pupils dilated with pure, unadulterated terror. The psychological power at the table shifted instantly, the invisible weight transferring from her shoulders to mine. She realized in a single heartbeat that her daughter was no longer an unpaid assistant. Her daughter was an auditor, and the audit was complete. "You," Patricia stammered the word, catching in her dry throat. "You pulled a credit report. I need a high-level government clearance for my new software engineering position," I replied, my voice maintaining that same clinical detachment. They check everything. They check every account, every balance, and every routing number used to make the minimum payments. The digital trail is very thorough. Richard, oblivious to the contents of the paper, leaned over to look. What is she talking about, Patricia? What is that document? Patricia quickly folded the paper in half, hiding the numbers, and shoved it into her designer handbag. Her mind was racing, trying to calculate the blast radius of this discovery. She had committed felony identity theft against her own child, and she knew I had the forensic skills to prove it. For a moment, genuine fear paralyzed her, but then the defining flaw of the Potomac social climber took over. Hubris. Patricia looked at my calm face, my steady hands, and the relaxed posture I held in my chair. She misread my composure. She thought my lack of screaming meant a lack of resolve. She assumed that because I was not currently calling the police from the dining room table, I was too weak to actually pull the trigger. She convinced herself that I was bluffing, that I would never actually destroy the family image over a financial misunderstanding. "We will discuss this at home," Patricia said, forcing a tight, brittle smile onto her face. "It is just a minor administrative error, Kendra. There is a logical explanation. We will sort it out privately. Do not ruin your graduation dinner over a paperwork glitch." I looked at the woman who had stolen my financial future to lease a luxury car. I looked at the woman who was currently trying to shove her own mother into a dark corner to protect a job promotion. There was no administrative error. There was only the cold truth of who my parents really were. I folded my napkin and placed it on the table. The time for sitting quietly was over. Patricia stood up. The sound of her heavy wooden chair scraping against the polished hardwood floor drew the attention of several nearby tables. She did not care. She smoothed the front of her expensive silk dress, a garment financed directly by my stolen identity, and slung her leather handbag over her shoulder. Her face transformed into a tight, brittle mask of manufactured offense. "If you are going to disrespect us in public," she whispered, her voice shaking with fake indignation, "we will not sit here and endure it. We are leaving." Richard was already out of his seat. My father never missed an opportunity to retreat from conflict. He buttoned his tailored suit jacket, keeping his eyes firmly focused on the exit signs above the mahogany doors. He did not look at me, and he certainly did not look at Helen. He simply nodded at Patricia, ready to escort her back to their leased vehicle, safely away from the consequences of their own actions. Derek was the last to stand. My older brother adjusted the collar of his designer shirt and leaned over the table, glaring at me with narrow eyes. "You are tearing this family apart over a piece of paper," he muttered. Derek was terrified. He did not care about family unity or moral integrity. He cared about his funding. If my parents went down for financial fraud, the seed money for his fake consulting agency would vanish overnight. His loyalty was entirely transactional, and he could see his bank account closing right before his eyes. I did not answer him. I sat in my chair and watched the three of them turn and walk away. They wove through the crowded dining room, projecting the image of a busy, important family called away by a sudden emergency. The heavy doors swung open and shut. A brief draft of cold night air swept into the lobby, and then they were gone. The silence at our table was profound. It was not the suffocating, anxious silence from earlier in the evening. It was the sudden ringing quiet of a pressurized cabin finally normalizing. The invisible weight that had been pressing down on my chest for 22 years lifted. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the ambient scent of roasted garlic and fresh bread. A young waiter approached our table a moment later. He carried a silver tray holding 2 plates of seared scallops and a small black leather folio. He looked at the empty chairs across from us, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. I offered him a polite smile. "My guests had a sudden emergency," I told him. "We will keep the food, but I will take the check now, please." He nodded, setting the warm plates down in front of Helen and me. He slid the leather folio across the white linen tablecloth. I opened it. The total was $640. It was a staggering sum for a college student. It was the equivalent of a month of groceries or dozens of long shifts at the campus help desk. A week ago, seeing this number on a receipt would have sent my heart racing. Today, it felt like the price of admission to a new life. I pulled my debit card from my wallet. This card was not tied to a platinum credit line. It was tied to my modest student checking account. Every single dollar in that account was earned under fluorescent lights, typing code, fixing hard drives, and dealing with frustrated professors. It was clean money. I placed the plastic card on top of the receipt. The waiter took it and walked away. I had just purchased my own independence. I looked across the table at Helen. I expected to see a fragile, elderly woman trembling with sorrow. Television shows and movies always depict grandmothers weeping when their children abandon them in public. But Helen was not weeping. She sat perfectly upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her dark eyes were sharp, bright, and calculating. She looked at me with the profound, quiet pride. "You handled that well," she said, her voice steady and rich with the familiar grit of Baltimore. "You did not let them see you bleed." I nodded, picking up my silver fork. "I learned from the best," I replied. We ate our meal in peace. The seared scallops were buttery and rich, pairing perfectly with the crisp asparagus. We did not discuss Patricia. We did not discuss Richard or the tantrum Derek threw before fleeing. We let the ghosts walk out the door and we refused to invite them back to the table. The background hum of the Potomac restaurant wrapped around us in a comforting blanket of noise. Clinking silverware, soft jazz playing from hidden speakers, the steady murmur of affluent conversations. For the first time in my adult life, I did not feel like an unpaid employee attending a mandatory corporate retreat. I was just a young woman having dinner with her grandmother. The waiter returned with my card and a small plate of complimentary dessert. It was a lemon tart topped with a delicate torched sugar glaze. I signed the receipt, leaving a generous tip, and pushed the folio away. I took a bite of the tart. It was cold, sharp, and intensely sweet. The flavor grounded me in the present moment. I was sitting here eating cold dessert, and I was officially an orphan. I had orphaned myself from my toxic parents by choice. The realization was heavy, but it was not sad. It felt like putting down a backpack filled with stones. Helen took a small bite of her dessert. She dabbed the corners of her mouth with her cloth napkin. She leaned forward slightly, her demeanor shifting into something focused and deliberate. She dropped a pebble of information into the quiet space between us. "Tell me about this new job of yours," Helen said, resting her arms on the table. "The defense contracting firm. Do you like the company you are going to work for?" I swallowed my bite of tart. "Yes," I said. "The starting salary is excellent, and the cybersecurity infrastructure they are building is incredibly advanced. I will be working at their main headquarters in Arlington. It is a towering glass building right off the highway." Helen nodded slowly, her eyes tracking a memory invisible to me. "Arlington," she repeated. "A tall glass building. The one with the heavy brass doors and the imported marble floors in the main lobby." I looked at her, surprised by the specific details. "Yes, that is exactly the building. How did you know about the brass doors?" Helen offered that same unbothered, knowing smile she had given Patricia earlier. "I used to clean offices in that exact building 25 years ago," she said quietly. "I know every inch of those marble floors. I know the layout of the executive suites. It is a very interesting place to work." The coincidence felt strange, but I did not press her for details. I assumed she was just reflecting on her long history in the commercial cleaning industry. I told her about my upcoming orientation, the security badge I would receive, and the corporate schedule. Helen listened intently, asking precise, intelligent questions about the company structure. She seemed remarkably interested in the executive hierarchy of the defense firm. The dinner slowly wound down. The restaurant began to thin out as the late hour approached. I helped Helen put on her worn navy coat, ensuring the frayed zipper was secure against the chill. We walked out through the heavy doors, leaving the scent of truffle oil behind. The night air was cool and sharp. I escorted her to my modest, reliable sedan parked in the back lot far away from the valet stand, where my parents usually showcased their leased vehicle. As I drove us back toward Baltimore, the silence in the car was comfortable and safe. But underneath the calm exterior, a new tension began to coil in my stomach. Patricia is a proud, vindictive woman. She had just suffered a humiliating defeat in front of her mother and her daughter. She had been forced to flee her favorite restaurant. She knew I possessed the encrypted dossier proving her financial crimes, and she knew I was no longer afraid of her. Patricia would not simply accept this defeat. A narcissist backed into a corner always retaliates. She could not attack me financially because her entire affluent lifestyle relied on my stolen credit. She could not attack me physically. That left only one avenue. She would target my reputation. She would target the one thing I valued most. The one thing that guaranteed my escape from her control. My new job. Patricia worked in the exact same industry. She possessed a vast network of corporate connections throughout Maryland and Virginia. As the highway lights flashed past the windshield, casting long shadows inside the car, I realized that the war did not end at the dinner table. The war had just begun, and my mother was about to launch a targeted strike against my future. The weekend passed with a deafening silence. My phone did not ring. No text messages arrived from the Potomac house demanding apologies or threatening consequences. For 2 days, I sat in my small apartment reviewing code for my final projects, waiting for the inevitable counterattack. A cornered predator does not retreat. It calculates the most efficient angle to strike your exposed throat. Monday morning arrived with a gray, overcast sky. My graduation ceremony was scheduled for the end of the week. I was drinking my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The caller identification displayed the main corporate number for the defense contracting firm in Arlington. I answered on the second ring. It was Sarah Lynn, the senior technical recruiter who had overseen my hiring process. Sarah was a sharp, pragmatic woman who had spent a decade headhunting cybersecurity talent for government contractors. She usually spoke with a brisk, cheerful efficiency. Today, her voice was tight. The cheerful efficiency was gone. "Kendra," she said, skipping the usual pleasantries. "Are you available to come into the Arlington office this morning? We have a situation regarding your security clearance and your onboarding status." My stomach dropped. I told her I could be there in 40 minutes. I grabbed my laptop, my keys, and my coat. The drive down the highway felt like navigating through a tunnel. Patricia had made her move. To understand how my mother operates, you must understand the ecosystem of the defense contracting world in the Washington metropolitan area. It is a small, insular community built on country club handshakes, alumni associations, and whispered favors over expensive lunches. Patricia had spent 15 years cultivating her network. She knew the vice presidents. She served on charity boards with their spouses. She understood exactly how to weaponize her social capital. I parked in the visitor lot of the towering glass building and took the elevator to the human resources floor. Sarah waited for me in a small, glass-walled conference room. She looked uncomfortable, her hands folded tightly over a manila folder. I took the seat across from her, placing my laptop bag on the floor. "I am going to speak to you very frankly." Sarah began, her eyes scanning my face for any sign of instability. "This morning, our executive vice president of operations received a phone call. It was from your mother." I kept my expression neutral. I did not gasp. I just nodded, waiting for the rest of the payload to drop. She introduced herself as a concerned parent. Sarah continued. "She told our executive that she was calling out of a desperate need to protect you and our firm. She claimed you are currently suffering from a severe psychological breakdown. She used words like erratic paranoid and delusional. She implied that the stress of graduation had triggered a mental health crisis, and she strongly suggested we revoke your offer before you undergo the federal security clearance process. She said a failure during that federal review would permanently damage your record, and she begged us to let you go so you could return home for residential psychiatric treatment." The sheer brilliance of the lie took my breath away. Patricia was not just trying to get me fired. She was framing the assassination of my career as an act of maternal mercy. She wanted to strip away my independent income, sabotage my clearance, and force me back into the Potomac house as a financial dependent. If I had no job, I had no power. If I was labeled mentally unstable, any accusations I made about identity theft could be easily dismissed as paranoid delusions. It was a masterful social engineering attack. It was designed to break my legs and then offer me a wheelchair provided I agreed to let her push it. Sarah watched me closely. "I realize this is highly sensitive," she said gently, "but our firm deals with classified national security data. We cannot onboard an analyst with a precarious psychological profile. I need to know what is happening, Kendra. Are you well?" I reached down and unzipped my bag. I pulled out my laptop and set it on the conference table. I opened the lid. The screen glowed to life. "I am perfectly well," I said, my voice steady and resonant in the quiet room. "I am not suffering from a breakdown, Sarah. I am suffering from a mother who is attempting to cover up a felony." Sarah blinked, taken aback by the clinical delivery of my response. I typed my master password and accessed my encrypted cloud server. I opened the incident report I had built 3 weeks ago. I turned the laptop around, sliding it across the polished table so the screen faced her. "I want you to look at this digital forensic report," I instructed her. 4 years ago, my parents stole my social security number and opened a platinum credit account in my name. They used it to finance their affluent lifestyle in Bethesda. They accumulated over $14,000 in fraudulent debt to pay for country club dues, luxury clothing, and a down payment on a leased vehicle for my brother. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she read the summary page. I scrolled down to the evidence section. I showed her the transaction logs. I showed her the metadata tracing the payment logins directly to the residential internet protocol address of my parents' home. I showed her the side-by-side photographs of the boutique receipts next to social media posts of Patricia wearing the stolen silk blouses. I provided a chain of custody for the data that would hold up in any federal court. My mother found out on Friday night that I had discovered the fraud. I explained, keeping my tone objective and professional. "She knows I need a pristine financial record to pass your security clearance. She knows that if I flag this account as fraudulent, the bank will initiate a federal investigation. She is terrified of going to prison, and she is terrified of losing her social standing." I paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle into the silent room. "She did not call your executive out of maternal concern," I concluded. "She called because she is trying to sever my independent income. If I lose this job, I lose my ability to support myself. She wants to force me back under her roof so she can control the narrative and keep me quiet. This is not a mental health crisis. This is corporate sabotage deployed to conceal identity theft." Sarah stared at the screen for a very long time. The pragmatic, cheerful recruiter was gone, replaced by a seasoned corporate professional who understood exactly what she was looking at. She scrolled through the internet protocol logs. She examined the cross-referenced timestamps. She saw the undeniable mathematical truth of the situation. When she finally looked up, her expression had shifted from wary concern to profound horror. Her jaw was tight. She closed the laptop and pushed it back across the table toward me. "I have worked in human resources for 15 years, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I have seen bitter divorces spill into the office. I have seen disgruntled former employers lie during reference checks. I have never in my entire career seen a mother attempt to execute a preemptive strike on her own child to cover up financial fraud." She leaned back in her chair, pressing her fingers to her temples. "The audacity is staggering. She really thought she could leverage a country club connection to destroy your career." "Will the firm revoke my offer?" I asked, needing to secure my perimeter. Sarah shook her head immediately. "We are a defense contractor, Kendra. We traffic in verified intelligence, not country club gossip. You have presented an impeccable forensic dossier. Your ability to document, analyze, and neutralize a threat without letting emotion compromise your judgment is exactly why we hired you for the cybersecurity division. You handled a hostile intrusion perfectly." She stood up and walked to the small kitchenette in the corner of the room, pouring herself a cup of water. She took a sip and turned back to face me. "I will handle the executive vice president," she promised. "I will explain that the phone call was a malicious interference attempt by an estranged family member. Your job is safe. Your clearance process will proceed as planned. But Kendra, you need to freeze your credit immediately, and you need to prepare yourself. A woman willing to burn her daughter to the ground will not stop here." I thanked her, packed my laptop back into my bag, and left the conference room. I walked out of the towering glass building and stood in the Arlington sunshine. The morning air was sharp against my face. Sarah was right. Patricia had escalated the conflict from a domestic dispute to a nuclear war. She had proven that there was no line she would not cross to protect her Bethesda facade. She viewed my independence as an existential threat to her survival. I unlocked my reliable sedan, slid into the driver's seat, and stared at the steering wheel. My graduation ceremony was approaching rapidly. 5,000 people would fill the university arena. Patricia, Richard, and Derek would undoubtedly attend, putting on their designer clothes to play the role of the proud, supportive family for the cameras. They would smile, clap, and post pictures online pretending the malicious phone call this morning had never happened. They would act as if the war did not exist, simply because they assumed they had already won it. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. They wanted to maintain the illusion of control. They wanted to smile for the cameras. I decided right then that I would let them smile. I would let them sit in the audience and preen for the crowd. I would let them feel safe right up until the exact moment the ground opened beneath their feet. The morning of the graduation ceremony arrived with a crisp, clear sky. I woke up at 5 o'clock and treated the next 2 hours as a tactical deployment. I laid my black graduation gown across the ironing board, pressing the cheap polyester with clinical precision. The smell of hot steam and starch filled my small apartment. I pinned the tassel to my cap, ensuring every thread aligned perfectly. There was no room for error today. I drove 40 miles north to Baltimore to pick up Helen. She waited on the front porch of her narrow brick row house wearing the same navy wool coat she had worn to the dinner. Underneath it, she wore a simple pressed cotton dress. She held a small leather purse in her calloused hands. Those hands had spent decades gripping heavy mop handles and industrial buckets, and now they rested neatly in her lap as she sat in the passenger seat of my reliable sedan. We did not speak much during the drive to the university. We did not need to. We both understood the gravity of the stage we were about to walk onto. The university arena was a colossal structure of steel and glass built to hold 5,000 people. By the time we arrived, the campus teemed with activity. Proud families carried bouquets of flowers and oversized balloons navigating the crowded walkways. The air hung thick with the scent of roasted peanuts from the concession stands and the nervous energy of thousands of students preparing to cross the stage. I guided Helen through the dense crowds, bypassing the long lines for general admission. Because I had maintained a flawless grade point average and secured my status as a top honors student, the university granted me 2 tickets for the reserved seating section. I escorted my grandmother past the metal barricades and walked her directly to the front rows. I found her a plush padded seat just a few yards away from the main podium. She sat down, her posture immaculate, her dark eyes scanning the sprawling arena with a quiet, observant grace. My phone vibrated in the pocket of my slacks. I pulled it out and looked at the illuminated screen. It was a text message from Patricia. "Kendra, sweetheart," the message read. "We just parked. Meet us by the west entrance in 10 minutes. We need to take a family photo before you line up. I want to post it on LinkedIn to share the good news with my professional network. See you soon." I stared at the words, marveling at the sheer audacity of the woman who typed them. Barely 48 hours had passed since Patricia attempted to destroy my career by faking a mental health crisis to my corporate recruiter. Less than a week had passed since she fled a Potomac restaurant to avoid being seen with her own mother. Yet here she was, utilizing the classic psychological reset of a manipulator. She simply pretended the sabotage never occurred. She expected me to fall back into line to smile for the camera and to provide the visual props necessary to maintain her affluent facade online. I did not reply. I locked the screen and slid the phone back into my pocket. I looked up toward the main concourse and spotted them instantly. Patricia, Richard, and Derek moved through the crowd like minor royalty inspecting their subjects. They dressed to project maximum wealth. Richard wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than my entire semester of textbooks. Derek strutted beside him in overpriced imported loafers and designer sunglasses despite being entirely indoors. Patricia led the charge wearing a sharp tailored blazer and holding a designer handbag financed by my stolen credit score. They played their roles flawlessly. Patricia smiled at passing strangers, projecting the image of a deeply supportive, successful matriarch arriving to celebrate her daughter. They found their seats in the general admission area, several rows behind the barricaded section where Helen sat. They did not notice my grandmother. They were too busy scanning the crowd for anyone important enough to network with. I left the seating area and joined the sea of black gowns in the staging tunnel. The heat of thousands of bodies pressed together felt intense. The low hum of excited whispers echoed off the concrete walls. A university official handed me a glossy program pamphlet as I found my place in the alphabetical line. I opened the thick paper booklet and scanned the itinerary. After the dean delivered the opening remarks and the degrees were conferred, the ceremony would conclude with an address from the keynote speaker. I read the name printed in bold, embossed ink. Victor Caldwell. He was the titan of the defense contracting industry, the billionaire who built a corporate empire from the ground up. More importantly, he was the chief executive officer of the exact firm where Patricia worked as a senior director. He was the man Patricia feared running into at the restaurant. Now he was scheduled to speak to an audience of 5,000 people standing just a few feet away from the woman Patricia tried to hide. I looked back towards the audience seating. The arena featured steep-tiered rows, allowing me a clear vantage point of my family. Patricia had secured a glossy program of her own. I watched as she opened it, her eyes tracking down the page until she saw the name of the keynote speaker. Even from a distance, I could see the physical transformation. Patricia sat up straighter, her chest puffing out with sudden inflated pride. She immediately turned to the family sitting next to her, a couple she had never met in her life. She pointed to the bold ink on the page, tapping it with her manicured fingernail. Her voice carried over the ambient noise of the stadium, sharp and desperate to be heard by anyone within a 50-foot radius. "That is Victor Caldwell," she announced to the strangers, projecting her words so the surrounding rows would turn and look. "He is the chief executive of my firm. We work very closely together. He is actually a close personal friend and my ultimate boss. We run in the exact same circles in Bethesda." The strangers nodded politely, offering tight, uncomfortable smiles, as Patricia continued to boast about her corporate connections and her elite status. She preened in her seat, adjusting her designer blazer, soaking in the perceived admiration of the crowd. She believed she orchestrated the perfect morning. She had a daughter graduating with honors, to boost her maternal image, a luxury car parked outside, and her revered boss taking the stage to validate her professional world. She had no idea that her entire reality rested on a fault line. I stood in the tunnel, listening to the commencement music begin to play over the towering audio system. The traditional march echoed through the steel rafters. The line of graduates began to move forward, shuffling toward the bright lights of the arena floor. I kept my eyes fixed on the podium, thinking about the encrypted dossier waiting in my digital cloud, the $14,000 of stolen debt, and the arrogant woman bragging in the stands. Patricia thought she controlled the narrative. She thought she successfully buried her working-class history and silenced the daughter she viewed as an unpaid employee. She was about to learn that true power does not need to announce itself to strangers in a crowded room. I stepped out of the tunnel and walked into the bright lights of the arena, ready to take my seat. The stage was set. The audience was captive. The keynote speaker waited in the wings. The commencement ceremony moved with a steady, rehearsed rhythm. Hundreds of names echoed through the cavernous space. I crossed the stage, accepted my diploma portfolio, and returned to my folding chair on the arena floor. The overhead lights beat down, generating a stifling heat beneath my polyester gown. I kept my posture rigid. I didn't look back toward the general admission seating. I knew Patricia was still holding court in the upper tiers, basking in the reflected glory of her high society fantasy. The university president returned to the main podium. He adjusted his microphone and cleared his throat. The restless murmur of 5,000 people settled into a quiet, expectant hush. He introduced the keynote speaker, rattling off a long list of corporate accolades, philanthropic awards, and industry milestones. Victor Caldwell walked onto the stage. He didn't possess the stiff, rehearsed demeanor of a typical corporate executive. He moved with a relaxed, predatory confidence. He wore a sharp-tailored suit that spoke of immense wealth, but he wore it comfortably like a second skin. As the chief executive officer of a global defense contracting firm, he commanded rooms filled with generals and senators. Taming a university arena required very little effort on his part. He stepped up to the podium and gripped the wooden edges. He didn't bring any notes. He looked out over the sea of graduates, letting the silence stretch just long enough to capture every ounce of attention in the building. When he began to speak, his voice resonated through the towering audio system, deep and incredibly clear. He didn't talk about synergy or climbing the corporate ladder. He didn't deliver a standard hollow commencement address about following your dreams. He spoke about grit. He spoke about the invisible people who actually build the empires the rest of the world takes for granted. He described the unseen labor that holds society together. He talked about the night shifts, the calloused hands, and the quiet sacrifices made by individuals who never get their names printed on a glossy program. I sat in my chair and listened. His words struck a profound chord. They stood in direct opposition to everything my mother valued. Patricia built her entire identity on visibility. She craved the spotlight. She despised the invisible labor of her own mother, treating Helen like a stain she needed to scrub out of her pristine Bethesda fabric. I could only imagine Patricia sitting in the stands right now, nodding along to Victor's speech without comprehending a single syllable of its actual meaning. She was likely smiling at the strangers next to her, desperate to project her proximity to his power. Victor continued his address, pacing slowly across the wide stage. He talked about loyalty and the rare, defining moments when true character reveals itself. He scanned the front rows of the audience as he spoke, making deliberate eye contact with the crowd. Then his pacing stopped. He froze midway across the stage. His eyes locked onto the reserved VIP section located just beyond the barricades. He stared directly at the front row. The smooth, rhythmic cadence of his speech halted instantly. He didn't stumble over a word. He simply stopped talking. The silence was sudden and severe. The microphone picked up the faint sound of his breathing, amplifying it across the stadium. 5,000 people held their breath, waiting for him to continue. He didn't continue. Victor Caldwell stared at my grandmother. Helen sat in her padded chair, wearing the worn navy wool coat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked back at the billionaire executive with the same calm, unbothered expression she had worn at the Potomac restaurant. Up in the seating area, just a few rows behind the barricade, a ripple of confusion spread. Patricia shifted in her folding chair. From my vantage point on the arena floor, I caught sight of her movement. Patricia sat up straighter. She adjusted the lapels of her designer blazer. She smoothed her hair. She noticed Victor looking toward her section, and her narcissism immediately filled the silence. She assumed her powerful boss had spotted his senior director in the crowd. She plastered a wide, eager smile across her face, preparing to offer a polite wave of recognition. She wanted the entire section to witness their elite connection. Victor ignored the teleprompter. He turned away from the podium entirely. The sound of his leather shoes hitting the wooden stage echoed through the speakers. He walked toward the edge of the platform. He descended the short flight of side stairs, leaving the bright spotlight behind. A low murmur of surprise rippled through the graduating class. Security guards shifted nervously, unsure if they should intervene. Victor Caldwell strode with absolute purpose across the concrete floor. He bypassed the front row of faculty members. He walked directly toward the VIP barricade. He didn't look at the thousands of bewildered faces watching him. His focus remained singular. He reached the velvet rope dividing the sections. A security guard quickly unhooked it, stepping aside. Victor moved into the reserved seating area. He walked straight past the row where Patricia sat eagerly waiting. He didn't even glance in her direction. Her eager smile faltered, replaced by a sudden sharp confusion as he moved past her without a flicker of recognition. Victor stopped directly in front of Helen. The arena was dead silent. The ambient noise of coughing and rustling programs ceased entirely. The air felt charged heavy with the weight of an unscripted reality unfolding in real time. Helen didn't stand. She remained seated, looking up at the towering executive. Victor reached down. He extended his hand, not offering a standard corporate handshake, but a gesture of profound personal reverence. Helen unclasped her hands. She raised her right arm. Victor took her rough, calloused hand in his. He held it gently, bowing his head just a fraction of an inch. He reached inside his suit jacket with his free hand and pulled out a small wireless lapel microphone. He clicked the power switch. The device emitted a sharp, high-pitched tone before stabilizing. He turned his body slowly, keeping Helen's hands securely in his own. He looked past the VIP section, raising his gaze to the general admission rows. His eyes locked onto Patricia. Patricia sat frozen in her chair. The confusion on her face morphed into a raw, paralyzing dread. She realized her powerful boss was holding the hand of the retired cleaning lady she had spent a lifetime trying to hide. Her brain struggled to process the visual contradiction. The two distinct worlds she had kept rigorously separated were colliding right in front of her. Victor raised the microphone to his mouth. His voice boomed through the stadium speakers, ringing with a cold, undeniable authority. "Meet your boss." The three words dropped like heavy stones into a still pond. The echo bounced off the steel rafters, returning to strike the audience a second time. A collective, audible gasp swept through the 5,000 people in the arena. The sheer theatricality of the moment sent a shockwave through the crowd, but the reaction in the general admission row was visceral. I watched the blood rapidly evacuate Patricia's face. Her complexion turned a sickening shade of ash. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. Her hands, previously resting proudly on her designer handbag, began to tremble. The manicured illusion she had spent 15 years building shattered in a single devastating heartbeat. The billionaire titan of her industry had just publicly subordinated her to the woman she deemed a social liability. The physical reality of the situation pinned her to her seat. The chief executive of her defense contracting firm didn't just know her mother. He deferred to her. He treated her with a level of respect Patricia had never achieved in her entire climbing career. Helen sat quietly, her hands still resting in Victor Caldwell's grip. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply allowed the truth to stand in the open air, unhidden and undeniable. The trap had closed. The audit was public. The social hierarchy of the Potomac elite had just been inverted, and my mother had no place left to hide. Victor released my grandmother's hand. He offered one final respectful nod before turning his back on the velvet barricade. The sound of his leather shoes hitting the concrete floor reverberated through the silent arena. He climbed the short flight of stairs and returned to the main podium. He did not look at the glowing teleprompter. He reached down, picked up his stack of prepared note cards, folded them in half, and slid them into his suit jacket pocket. The stadium remained frozen. 5,000 people sensed the shift in the atmosphere. The standard commencement address had vanished. Something much older and far more personal was taking its place. 25 years ago, Victor said, his voice filling the cavernous space. I was not a chief executive officer. I was a desperate man sitting in a rented windowless office in Arlington, watching my first company bleed to death. He gripped the wooden edges of the podium. I had a vision for a logistics software platform, but I had run out of runway. The venture capital dried up. My partners walked away. I could not afford my apartment rent, so I slept under my desk. I survived on tap water and stale vending machine crackers. I stayed awake for days, staring at lines of broken code, waiting for the bank to call and finalize my financial ruin. He paused, letting the harsh reality of early failure settle over the graduating class. But I was not alone in that building. he continued. Every night right around midnight, the elevator doors would open. A woman would push a heavy yellow cleaning cart down the hallway. She smelled like industrial bleach and peppermint. She emptied my trash cans. She vacuumed the cheap carpet around my sleeping bag. And when she saw that I was starving, she started bringing an extra thermos of hot coffee and half a sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil. She never asked for a stake in the company. She never asked for a board seat. She just saw a human being drowning, and she offered a raft. I sat in my folding chair on the arena floor, my eyes fixed on the stage. I recognized the scent of bleach and peppermint immediately. I remembered waking up to that exact smell in the Baltimore row house. The bank called on a Tuesday. Victor said, the memory hardening his jaw. They denied the final bridge loan. It was over. I packed my belongings into a cardboard box. I sat in the dark, waiting for the cleaning crew to arrive so I could hand over the office keys and walk out into the street. The woman with the yellow cart found me sitting there in the dark. She asked me how much capital I needed to keep the servers running and secure the first defense contract. I told her the number. I laughed because it was a fortune. It was a sum so high it felt like fiction. Victor looked away from the crowd. He looked back down at the front row, his eyes resting on Helen. The next night, she did not bring a sandwich, he said, his voice thick with a sudden raw emotion. She brought a cashier's check for $60,000. A low murmur rippled through the audience. She was a widow, Victor explained, scanning the faces of the silent graduates. That check was the entirety of her late husband's life insurance payout. She had lived in a modest Baltimore row house for years, hoarding every penny, working the night shift to ensure her family would never face destitution. It was her entire safety net. She handed it to a failing entrepreneur because she believed in the math, and she believed in the man sitting on the floor. I told her it was too risky. I told her she could lose everything. She looked at me and said she spent her whole life scrubbing floors so she could build a door. She told me to open it. Victor leaned into the microphone. I did not take it as a loan. I drew up an equity agreement on the spot using printer paper. I gave her a 35% silent stake in my company. That logistics platform secured its first defense contract a month later. 10 years after that, it became the global defense contracting firm you know today. The weight of his words began to crash over the arena in waves. The students might not have understood the specific family dynamics at play, but the adults in the audience recognized the sheer magnitude of the financial reality. A 35% equity stake in a multi-billion-dollar defense empire was a staggering sum of wealth. It was generational power. Victor turned his head, aiming his gaze directly at the upper tiers of the general admission seating. He locked eyes with Patricia. There are people in this world who mistake a job title for actual authority. Victor said, his voice turning cold and precise. There are corporate directors who sit in corner offices proud of their polished desks and their imported cars, believing they are the sole architects of their own success. They forget that the building they sit in, the paycheck they collect, and the very desk they occupy are owned by the invisible people they walk past in the lobby. The irony was dense enough to suffocate a person. Patricia had spent 15 years treating her mother like a dirty secret. She had forced Helen to the back of a Potomac restaurant because she believed a retired cleaning lady was a social liability to her corporate image. She had bragged to strangers in the stands about her close personal relationship with the chief executive officer. She had no idea that the woman she shoved into the shadows was the silent architect of her entire career. Patricia was a mid-level employee in an empire financed by the mop and bucket she so deeply despised. From my seat, I watched Patricia physically crumble. The frantic, manicured energy that defined her existence vanished. Her shoulders slumped forward. Her mouth remained open, gasping for air in short, shallow bursts. The realization that she had been working for her mother this entire time broke her mind. Every executive bonus she received, every promotion she celebrated, every country club due she paid, was subsidized by the Baltimore row house. She slowly turned her head to look at the strangers sitting next to her. The same parents she had boasted to 10 minutes earlier were now staring at her with a mixture of pity and revulsion. The high society facade had melted away, leaving a terrified, exposed fraud in its place. Richard sat frozen next to her. His usual strategy of looking away and avoiding conflict failed him. He stared at the stage, his eyes wide, finally grasping the true cost of his endless passivity. He had allowed his wife to humiliate the woman who literally owned their livelihood. Helen did not turn around to look at her daughter. She did not stand up and wave to the crowd. She remained seated in the padded chair, her worn navy coat draped over her shoulders. Her face was a mask of calm, unshakable dignity. She did not need to shout to prove her worth. True power never needs to announce itself. It simply waits for the right moment to cast a shadow over the people who thought they were standing in the sun. Victor finished his address. He told the graduating class to respect the invisible labor that supports their ambition. He stepped away from the podium. The stadium erupted into applause. The sound was deafening, a roaring wave of validation that shook the steel rafters. I stood up with my classmates clapping until my hands stung. I looked at the VIP section. Helen offered a small, polite nod to the stage. She had endured decades of slights, insults, and social exclusion from her own daughter. She had watched Patricia drain my college funds and steal my identity to fund a fake Potomac lifestyle. She had waited 25 years to call the debt due. The ceremony transitioned into the final academic procession. The marching band began to play. The graduates filed out of the rows, heading toward the main concourse to meet their families. The celebration was officially starting, but for the Vance family, the celebration was over. The pristine facade had been stripped away under the brightest lights possible. As I joined the flow of students moving toward the exit, I prepared myself for the inevitable fallout. A narcissist stripped of their public image does not apologize. They panic. They attempt to seize control of whatever assets remain in the blast radius. I knew Patricia and Richard would not slink away in shame. They would try to spin the narrative. They would try to lay claim to the empire they had just discovered. They would try to bully an 82-year-old woman in a crowded hallway. I tightened my grip on my diploma portfolio. I navigated through the chaotic sea of black gowns and flying caps, heading toward the staging area where my grandmother waited. The trap had sprung, but the animal was still thrashing. The sea of black gowns and flying tassels blurred together as I navigated the crowded stadium floor. My grip on the padded leather diploma folder remained firm, but my focus had shifted entirely away from the academic celebration. I bypassed the cheering groups of students and the tearful parents posing for photographs. I headed straight for the velvet ropes of the reserved seating section. Helen was already standing waiting for me near the concrete stairs. She looked serene, a striking contrast to the chaotic energy vibrating through the university arena. The worn navy wool coat draped over her shoulders seemed to carry a different weight now. It was no longer a symbol of blue-collar struggle. It was the armor of a silent architect who had just leveled a corporate dynasty. I reached her side, offering a gentle smile. The ambient noise of the crowd grew overwhelming, a roaring wave of overlapping voices and marching band music. I placed a hand on her elbow, guiding her away from the main concourse. We moved toward a secluded side corridor, a quiet concrete hallway used primarily by catering staff and event security. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed a low, steady rhythm. The air here felt cooler, stripped of the stifling heat generated by 5,000 bodies. We did not make it to the exit doors. The sound of rapid, heavy footsteps echoed down the narrow corridor behind us. I turned around. Patricia, Richard, and Derek blocked the hallway, forming a human barricade between us and the parking lot. The high society polish they had projected all morning was fractured. Patricia looked feverish. Her tailored designer blazer was slightly rumpled and her chest heaved with shallow, frantic breaths. Richard wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead using a pristine silk handkerchief. Derek paced like a caged animal, his imported loafers scuffing the concrete floor. They had tracked us down, bypassing the celebratory crowds, driven by a singular, blinding desperation. A normal mother might have approached her daughter with an apology. A normal executive might have approached the majority shareholder of her firm with profound humility and remorse. Patricia did neither. Narcissism does not allow for retreat. When a narcissist faces a reality that shatters their ego, they double down. They attempt to rewrite history in real time. Patricia closed the distance between us, her eyes locked entirely on Helen. She ignored me, pretending the graduation ceremony had never happened. "Mom," Patricia said, forcing a breathy, frantic laugh that echoed harshly off the concrete walls. "Why did you keep this a secret from us? We are family. You should have told me you held those shares. We could have managed this together. You know how volatile the defense sector is right now." Helen did not respond. She just watched her daughter with dark, unreadable eyes. Patricia took another step forward, her tone shifting into a rapid, authoritative cadence. She was trying to assume control of the narrative through sheer volume. "Victor should never have put you on the spot like that. It was highly unprofessional. But we can fix this. Those shares are family assets, Mom. They belong to the Vance legacy. As a senior director at the firm, I know the board of directors. I understand the corporate voting structure. You are 82 years old. You cannot be burdened with navigating high-level equity decisions." The arrogance was suffocating. Patricia had spent the last 2 decades treating her mother like a biological inconvenience. She had tried to hide Helen in a restaurant alcove less than a week ago. Now she was framing herself as the rightful steward of Helen's wealth. She treated the 35% stake in a multi-billion-dollar empire, not with respect, but as a resource she was entitled to plunder. "I need you to assign me your proxy voting rights immediately," Patricia demanded, her voice tight with greed. "It is the only way to protect our standing at the company. I can consolidate our power on the board." Derek pushed his way forward, shoving his hands into the pockets of his tailored slacks. He looked at Helen as if she were a walking automated teller machine. "And my consulting agency is ready to scale." Derek whined, his voice dripping with unearned entitlement. "We are in a critical growth phase. A $1 million seed injection is pocket change for a majority stakeholder. I need that capital by Monday to secure the new office lease in Arlington. You can liquidate a fraction of a percent of your shares to cover it. It stays in the family. It is an investment in my future." He spoke with casual cruelty, demanding $1 million from the grandmother he had mocked with a promotional shoelace t-shirt just a few months prior. Richard stepped into the center of the hallway, adopting the role of the rational patriarch. He reached inside his expensive suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of printer paper. The edges were slightly crumpled. He smoothed the document against his thigh and held it out toward Helen. "I went to the university library during the final speeches," Richard explained, offering a patronizing, soothing smile. "I downloaded a standard power of attorney form and printed it. This is for your own protection, Helen. Your mind is getting older. The stress of managing this level of wealth could be dangerous for your health. You need to sign this and let us handle the heavy lifting. We will take over the asset management." He pulled a silver pen from his shirt pocket, clicked the top and extended it toward her. He was attempting to bully an elderly woman into signing away her autonomy in a sterile concrete hallway. I stood there observing the scene through the clinical detached lens of my profession. In cybersecurity, we are trained to identify hostile intrusions. When a virus breaches a network, you do not negotiate with it. You do not ask a Trojan horse why it decided to corrupt your files. You do not appeal to the moral conscience of a malware script. You identify the threat, you isolate the compromised sector, and you execute a protocol of absolute containment. My family was a detected malware threat. Their greed was the virus, and they were actively trying to override my grandmother's administrative privileges. I stepped forward, inserting myself physically between Helen and the 3 of them. I established a hard perimeter. Richard blinked, surprised by the sudden movement. "Kendra," he muttered, "move out of the way. We are conducting family business." I reached out and plucked the silver pen from his fingers. I took the folded power of attorney document from his other hand. I did not break eye contact with him as I tore the paper down the middle. I stacked the 2 halves, tore them again, and let the shredded pieces flutter to the concrete floor. "You are not conducting family business. I said, my voice resonating with cold, load-bearing authority. You are attempting to commit elder financial abuse in a public building. Patricia gasped, her face flushing with renewed rage. How dare you speak to your father that way? You know nothing about corporate equity. I know how to run an audit, I countered, keeping my tone perfectly level. I know that you are drowning in debt. I know that Derek has defaulted on 3 separate business loans. I know that your Potomac lifestyle is a hollow shell financed by fraud. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Patricia, forcing her to retreat a few inches. The emotional manipulation they relied on for 22 years failed to compute. I offered them 0 emotion. I gave them no anger to feed on, no tears to mock, and no guilt to exploit. Helen is not a resource for you to mine, I stated, locking my eyes onto my mother. She is not a family asset. She is the silent architect who built the roof over your head, and you repaid her with decades of humiliation. Derek scoffed, crossing his arms. You are just jealous because you want the money for yourself. You are trying to cut us out. I turned my gaze to my brother. The golden child looked incredibly small in the harsh fluorescent lighting. You do not have a consulting agency, Derek. You have a leased car you cannot afford and a website filled with buzzwords. You are a bad investment, and the funding has officially dried up. Richard tried to step around me, reaching a hand out toward Helen again. Helen, please be reasonable. Do not take another step toward her. I warned, my voice dropping an octave. The clinical detachment radiated from my posture. I am the firewall now. You will not pass. The 3 of them stood frozen in the hallway. The realization settled over them like a heavy winter chill. They could not bully their way through the obstacle. They could not scream their way to $1 million seed injection. The social engineering attack had failed. The phishing scam was blocked. They were looking at a daughter who refused to play the role of the compliant draft horse, and they had no alternative strategy. Patricia stared at the shredded pieces of the power of attorney forms scattered near her designer shoes. She looked up at me, her chest rising and falling in rapid succession. She realized she was losing her grip on the ultimate prize, and the desperation in her eyes shifted into a dangerous, cornered panic. She opened her mouth, preparing to launch a final desperate attack to break my perimeter. Patricia inhaled deeply, her chest expanding as she prepared to unleash a torrent of verbal abuse designed to shatter my resolve. I did not give her the oxygen to begin her assault. I broke eye contact, shifted my stance, and unzipped the black canvas tote bag resting on my right shoulder. I reached inside and withdrew a thick manila envelope. It was heavy, packed tight with dozens of printed pages and separated by colored plastic tabs. I pivoted toward the concrete wall. A stainless steel catering table sat abandoned in the hallway, covered with a white cloth and several empty glass water pitchers. I dropped the envelope onto the table. The heavy thud echoed off the concrete floors, forcing the 3 of them to look at the document. I untwisted the string closure and flipped the top open. We are not going to debate the emotional dynamics of this family, I said, keeping my voice pitched at a calm, professional volume. We are going to conduct a comprehensive security review. I am going to brief you on the exact status of your vulnerabilities, just as I would brief a corporate board of directors following a data breach. I reached into the envelope and pulled out the first stack of documents secured with a bright red paperclip. I spread the pages across the white tablecloth, ensuring Patricia had a clear view of the bank logos and the itemized billing statements. Section 1 covers the $14,000 of fraudulent debt attached to my Social Security number. I explained, tapping the top page with my index finger. 4 weeks after my 18th birthday, you opened a platinum credit account using my credentials. You utilized this account to finance your affluent Bethesda lifestyle. I have charted every transaction over the last 4 years. I have cross-referenced the dates of your luxury boutique purchases with your public social media posts. Patricia stared at the photographs printed on the paper. She saw images of herself smiling at charity luncheons wearing silk blouses paid for by her daughter. Her throat worked as she swallowed dryly. More importantly, I continued moving to the next page. I pulled the metadata from the bank portal. The login history traces every online payment directly back to the residential internet protocol address assigned to your Potomac home. I have the routing numbers matching your primary checking account. In the state of Maryland, utilizing a stolen identity to secure credit is a felony. Wire fraud carries a penalty of up to 20 years in federal prison. Richard physically stumbled backward. His shoulders hit the concrete wall of the corridor. He looked at his wife, a sudden wave of nausea twisting his features. He realized the gravity of the legal threat hanging over their heads. They had crossed a boundary that could not be erased by a hollow apology or a forced family dinner. I did not pause to let them recover. I reached back into the envelope and withdrew the second stack of documents secured with a blue paperclip. I laid it down next to the financial logs. Section 2 covers your recent attempt at corporate sabotage, I said, shifting my gaze entirely to Patricia. You realized on Friday night that I had discovered your financial crimes. You knew my upcoming software engineering position required a pristine federal security clearance. You also knew that if I lost my independent income, I would be forced back under your control. So you placed a phone call to the senior technical recruiter at my new firm. Patricia squeezed her eyes shut. She shook her head slowly, a pathetic attempt to deny a reality that was already fully documented. You introduced yourself as a concerned mother, I stated flatly. You fabricated a story about a severe psychological breakdown. You tried to weaponize mental health to sever my employment contract. You begged them to revoke my offer. Unfortunately for you, the recruiter is a seasoned professional who documents every external communication. I sat in her office this morning. We reviewed your targeted interference together. She was horrified by your conduct. Your corporate connections in Arlington are no longer your allies. They are now witnesses to your desperation. Derek stepped away from his mother, distancing himself from the sinking ship. He looked at the paperwork on the catering table with wide, panicked eyes. But I had not forgotten about him. I pulled out the final stack of paper secured with a black paperclip. I dropped it heavily onto the stainless steel surface. Section 3 is a broader assessment of the Vance family portfolio, I announced. If you are going to demand a $1 million seed injection from Helen, we need to examine your actual financial health. I ran a standard public records search on all of you. I looked at Richard, dissecting his patriarchal illusion. The Potomac house currently carries 2 underwater mortgages. You have leveraged every ounce of equity to maintain a lifestyle you cannot afford. Your credit utilization is maximized. I turned to Derek, watching the golden child shrink under the fluorescent lights. You do not run a successful consulting agency. You have 3 defaulted business loans on record. The luxury car you drove to this graduation ceremony is flagged for repossession. You have 0 active clients and a negative cash flow. The silence in the hallway was stark. The background noise of the stadium seemed to fade away entirely, leaving only the brutal mathematical truth of their existence. They had spent decades treating Helen like a filthy secret, projecting an image of effortless wealth and untouchable prestige. I had just dismantled their entire reality using nothing but printer paper and basic forensic analysis. Their lifestyle was not an empire. It was a heavily leveraged lie built on stolen credit and unpaid debts. You have spent your entire lives operating on a social engineering script, I told them, my voice echoing coldly in the narrow space. You manipulate, you extort, and you hide your failures behind leased cars and country club memberships. You thought my competence existed solely to serve you. You thought you could exploit my labor without ever facing a consequence. I picked up the final summary page of the dossier. I held it out, waiting for Patricia to meet my eyes. When she finally looked up, her expression was vacant. The narcissism had been systematically deleted from her programming. She looked at me with the pure, primal terror of a cornered animal facing the end of its existence. You taught me that love in this family is earned, I said, delivering the clinical thesis of my revenge. You made sure I knew every single day that affection required payment. I learned your lessons perfectly. I am just auditing the accounts, Mom, and you are severely overdrawn. Patricia stared at the paperwork. She finally grasped the undeniable reality of her situation. She was not looking at a compliant daughter anymore. She was looking at the executioner of her freedom. I held the irrefutable evidence of identity theft, wire fraud, and corporate sabotage. I held the keys to federal prison, and she knew I would not hesitate to turn the lock if she took one more aggressive step toward my grandmother. They were fully contained. The threat was neutralized. The human barricade they formed across the hallway dissolved as Richard slumped against the wall, running a trembling hand over his face. Derek stared at the floor, realizing his endless supply of funding had vanished forever. Helen stood silently behind me, a witness to the total collapse of the family dynamic she had endured for decades. The power structure had inverted. The transition was complete. But before Patricia could attempt to drop to her knees and beg for mercy, the heavy metal door at the end of the corridor clicked open. The sound shattered the heavy silence. The final legal failsafe was about to enter the hallway, ready to lock the newly built perimeter into permanent reality. The heavy metal door at the far end of the corridor clicked open. The sharp metallic sound echoed against the bare concrete walls, slicing through the thick tension we had built around the catering table. A man stepped into the harsh fluorescent light. He did not look like a university security guard or a catering manager assigned to clear the water pitchers. He moved with the quiet, expensive grace of a high-tier corporate litigator. He wore a tailored navy suit that absorbed the overhead glare, and he carried a slim, dark leather briefcase. He walked down the hallway toward our frozen group, the steady rhythm of his leather shoes striking the floor like a metronome. His eyes scanned the shredded pieces of the power of attorney form scattered across the concrete. He noted the stacked financial dossiers resting on the stainless steel table. He did not look surprised by the wreckage. He looked like a professional arriving exactly on schedule to finalize a transaction. Patricia turned her head, desperate for a lifeline. She recognized the man instantly. Her pale face twitched with a sudden, frantic hope. She knew him as the chief legal counsel for the defense contracting firm. She likely assumed Victor Caldwell had sent him to manage the public relations fallout of the commencement speech. She took a half step toward him, ready to spin her web of lies, ready to explain that her mother was simply a confused, elderly woman who needed to be quietly escorted off the premises. Helen moved first. My grandmother stepped out from behind the physical perimeter I had established. She placed her calloused hand on my shoulder, giving my collarbone a gentle, reassuring squeeze, and then she walked past me. She stood in the center of the hallway, directly in the path of her daughter. The worn navy wool coat hung loosely over her frame, but she looked taller than I had ever seen her. The quiet, subservient posture she usually maintained around my parents vanished entirely. Patricia, Helen said. Her voice was not loud. It was rich with the gravel of Baltimore, steady and unyielding. You can stop calculating. The ledger is closed. Patricia froze mid-step. Mom? She whispered, her tone shifting into a breathless, pleading register. You do not understand what is happening here. Kendra is trying to ruin us. She is pulling up old credit card statements and making wild accusations. I understand everything, Helen replied, keeping her dark eyes locked on her daughter. I have understood everything for a very long time. Helen looked at Richard, who was still leaning heavily against the concrete wall, then at Derek, who was staring at his shoes. Finally, she brought her gaze back to Patricia. You spent the last 2 decades treating me like an embarrassing stain on your Bethesda fabric. You hid me from your colleagues. You shoved me into the shadows at restaurants and begged me not to speak at social gatherings. You accepted my silence as a sign of weakness. You thought because I scrubbed floors for a living, I lacked the intellect to see what you were doing to your own child. Helen paced a slow, deliberate step to the right. I watched you turn Kendra into a draft horse. I watched you drain her college savings, demand her labor, and mock her ambition. I sat in your living room during those tense Sunday dinners and listened to you extract her youth to finance your country club dues. I watched Kendra work double shifts at a tech desk just to buy groceries while you paraded around in silk blouses paid for with stolen money. Why did you not stop it? Patricia cried out. a sudden, desperate tear spilling over her eyelashes. If you had millions of dollars in equity, why did you let us struggle? Why did you sit there and watch me fight for every promotion when you could have given us a comfortable life? Because I needed a stress test, Helen answered, her voice dropping into a register of chilling clarity. Wealth is a corrosive substance, Patricia. It burns through weak character. My late husband and I worked too hard for that safety net. When Victor turned my life insurance payout into a defense empire, I knew the sudden influx of power would destroy anyone who was not ready to carry it. Helen gestured toward me. I knew what you were. I needed to see what Kendra would become. I needed to watch her grow up under the pressure of your narcissism. I needed to see if she would break, or if she would build a spine made of steel. I stayed quiet to see if she would inherit your greed, or if she would learn to secure her own perimeter. Today, she proved she can handle a hostile threat without losing her moral compass. She did not scream. She documented the breach. She is ready. The corporate litigator reached our group. He offered a slight respectful bow to Helen, ignoring Patricia and Richard entirely. He set his slim leather briefcase onto the stainless steel catering table, resting it right next to my forensic dossier. He snapped the brass locks open with 2 sharp clicks. Patricia stared at the briefcase, her eyes widening as the attorney pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy archival paper. Blue tabs marked the signature lines. As instructed, madame, the attorney said, addressing Helen with total deference. The transfer was executed and finalized at 5 o'clock yesterday evening. The ink is dry. The filings are registered with the state of Maryland and the corporate board. Helen nodded. She turned her attention back to the terrified woman standing in front of her. You brought a fake power of attorney form to a graduation ceremony, Helen said, glancing at the shredded white paper on the floor. You tried to bully an old woman into signing away her autonomy in a concrete hallway because you thought you could seize control of my assets. You are about 24 hours too late, Patricia. The attorney stepped forward, holding the document so Patricia could read the bold legal heading at the top of the page. Yesterday afternoon, he explained in a crisp, measured tone, your mother transferred her entire 35% equity stake into a blind, irrevocable trust. She no longer holds direct ownership of the shares. The asset is permanently shielded from any external claims, probate interference, or power of attorney manipulation. Patricia stopped breathing. Her chest froze. Her eyes darted from the attorney to the thick stack of paperwork. Who controls it? She asked, the words scraping painfully against her dry throat. Who manages the equity? The attorney flipped to the final signature page. The sole beneficiary and managing executor of the trust is your daughter, Kendra Vance. She holds exclusive proxy voting rights and total administrative control over the asset disbursements. The hallway spun into a profound, suffocating silence. The structural reality of the Vance family collapsed in real time. Patricia could not manipulate Helen. She could not force an elderly woman into a nursing home to seize control of a bank account. Helen had legally removed herself from the equation, placing the entire multi-billion-dollar defense equity directly into the hands of the daughter Patricia had spent 4 years exploiting. Patricia looked at me. The realization hit her with physical force. She had stolen $14,000 from my credit history to buy designer clothes and lease payments. In return, I now controlled the majority stake of the company that issued her paychecks. She was entirely at my mercy. Mom. Patricia whimpered, looking back at Helen. Her voice was stripped of all its Bethesda polish. It was the desperate, raw plea of a cornered thief realizing the vault was empty. How could you do this to your own flesh and blood? How could you hide this from me? Helen stood tall, her shoulders squared beneath the worn wool coat. She looked at Patricia with icy calm. I did not hide my money to punish you, Patricia. I hid it because I knew the moment you had it, you would use it to crush this girl. You are a terrible investment. The words struck Patricia like a physical blow. She staggered back, bumping into Richard, who caught her by the elbows to keep her from falling. Derek stared at the ceiling, his jaw hanging open as his $1 million seed funding evaporated into the sterile air. They were trapped. They were boxed into a corner of their own making. The legal reality settled over the concrete corridor. Patricia could not negotiate with an irrevocable trust. She could not gaslight a legal document filed with the state. She was staring at a fortified wall, and I was holding the only key. I looked at the three of them, feeling nothing but the cold, steady rhythm of a successful containment protocol. The attorney closed his briefcase with a sharp click. He adjusted his silk tie and turned his attention directly to Patricia. He did not look at her as a colleague. He did not look at her as a senior director. He looked at her as an impending liability. The personal family drama had concluded. The corporate consequences were about to begin. The corporate litigator adjusted his silk tie. He stepped away from Helen and closed the physical distance between himself and Patricia. The deferential posture he held while speaking to my grandmother vanished. He replaced it with the cold, sterile authority of a man employed to protect a billion-dollar defense empire from internal liabilities. Patricia the attorney said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. You are no longer speaking to your mother, and you are no longer speaking to your daughter. You are currently speaking to the chief legal counsel of your employer. Patricia shrank back against Richard. Her manicured hands gripped the lapels of her designer blazer. She tried to maintain eye contact with the attorney, but her confidence had been systematically dismantled. She looked like a hollow shell of the senior director who had strutted through the university arena just an hour prior. The defense contracting industry operates under a strict, unforgiving regulatory framework. The attorney explained, his tone devoid of any empathy. We traffic in classified national security data. We hold top-secret facility clearances. Every single employee from the janitorial staff to the executive board is bound by an ironclad ethics and compliance clause. You signed this agreement on your first day of employment 15 years ago. He reached toward the stainless steel catering table. He placed his hand flat on top of my forensic dossier, tracing the edge of the printed bank statements. This morning, you attempted to sabotage the federal security clearance of an incoming cybersecurity analyst. The attorney continued, letting the weight of the accusations settle in the narrow hallway. You fabricated a psychological crisis to coerce a technical recruiter into revoking an employment offer. That alone is a severe breach of professional conduct. But this dossier reveals something far worse. You committed felony identity theft against the very same analyst. You utilized stolen credentials to accumulate fraudulent debt. Patricia opened her mouth to argue, perhaps to claim it was a familial misunderstanding, but the attorney raised a single finger, silencing her instantly. Do not attempt to mitigate this, he warned. The victim of your financial crime holds an active government clearance process. By tethering fraudulent debt to her social security number, you did not just steal money to buy clothes and fund country club memberships. You actively jeopardized the security clearance of a federal contractor. You made her a potential liability. If a government auditor discovers this fraud during a routine background check, they will trace the origin of the theft. They will find a senior director at our firm executing cybercrimes against her own family. The Department of Defense would launch a full-scale investigation into our corporate culture. You are a walking, breathing threat to our federal contracts. Richard swallowed hard, his throat tight with panic. He looked at the exit door, clearly calculating if he could simply walk away and pretend he had never met his wife. Derek leaned against the wall, staring blankly at the shredded pieces of his fake power of attorney form, his dreams of seed funding turning to dust under the harsh fluorescent lights. The attorney picked up his slim leather briefcase. He clicked the brass locks and opened the lid. He reached inside and withdrew a single sheet of heavy stock paper. He laid it flat on the stainless steel catering table right next to my evidence envelope. Victor Caldwell is a pragmatic man, the attorney stated, smoothing the edges of the paper. He protects his investments, and he respects the wishes of his majority shareholder. Helen asked him to handle this matter quietly without creating a media spectacle that could disrupt the firm. Therefore, I am authorized to present you with a binary choice. Patricia stared at the single sheet of paper. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. What is that? She asked, her voice cracking. This is an immediate binding resignation agreement, the attorney replied. It dictates that you are stepping down from your position as senior director for personal reasons effective as of this exact minute. You will clear out your desk by proxy. You will not set foot in the Arlington headquarters ever again. He pulled a silver pen from his suit pocket and set it gently on top of the resignation agreement. If you sign this document, the attorney detailed, you will forfeit all of your unvested stock options. You will surrender your executive pension package. You will also sign a legally binding promissory note attached to the back of the agreement, assuming full unmitigated responsibility for the $14,000 credit card debt you fraudulently placed in Kendra's name. The debt will transfer to your Social Security number within 3 business days. Patricia let out a quiet, wounded noise. She realized the financial devastation this entailed. Without her inflated executive salary, without her unvested stock options, the underwater mortgages on the Potomac house would consume them in a matter of months. She would have to sell her designer wardrobe just to keep the lights on. And if I refuse to sign it, Patricia whispered, looking for a loophole that did not exist. If you refuse to sign, the attorney, said his voice dropping into a register of pure surgical precision, Kendra will hand this forensic dossier directly to the federal authorities. You will be arrested for identity theft and wire fraud. While you are sitting in a holding cell, Victor Caldwell will terminate your employment for cause. A termination for cause nullifies your severance package instantly. You will receive nothing. You will be a convicted felon, and you will bankrupt your husband paying for a criminal defense attorney you cannot afford. The quiet brutality of the ultimatum hung in the corridor. There was no room for negotiation. There was no human resources department to appeal to. It was a flawless, inescapable trap built from the consequences of her own actions. I watched my mother process the end of her carefully curated existence. She had spent a lifetime erasing her Baltimore roots. She had rejected the scent of bleach and peppermint, choosing instead the hollow fragrance of truffle oil and status. She had traded her moral compass for a leased luxury sport utility vehicle. Now the bill was due. The tragic irony of the situation was almost suffocating. Just a few days ago, Patricia sat in a prestigious Potomac restaurant. She demanded I hide Helen in a dark alcove. She treated her mother like a biological inconvenience. If she had simply allowed Helen to sit at the table in peace, if she had treated her mother to a nice dinner and celebrated my college degree, the evening would have ended with a polite toast. Patricia would have eventually discovered the irrevocable trust under different circumstances. She would have realized her mother owned 35% of a defense empire. She could have inherited a dynasty. She could have secured her promotion, funded Derek's business, and lived the rest of her life in untouchable luxury. Instead, her snobbery and her greed blinded her. Her desperate need to project superiority caused her to alienate the only person who could have handed her the world. She burned down a multi-billion-dollar lottery ticket because she did not like the coat the messenger was wearing. Patricia looked at me. Her eyes were hollow, stripped of the manicured arrogance that had defined our relationship for 22 years. She searched my face for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of the compliant daughter she used to command. I gave her nothing. I stood beside my grandmother, maintaining a posture of calm, unwavering resolve. I was the firewall, and she had failed the security check. Richard placed a trembling hand on Patricia's shoulder. "Sign it," he muttered, his voice defeated and thin. "We cannot afford a federal trial. Sign the paper, Patricia." Patricia closed her eyes. A single silent tear tracked through her expensive makeup, leaving a jagged line down her cheek. She did not scream. She did not throw a tantrum. The energy required to fight had been entirely drained from her body. The realization of her self-inflicted ruin crushed the fight out of her. She stepped away from the concrete wall. She walked slowly toward the stainless steel catering table. Her movements were stiff, robotic, like a machine functioning on a depleted battery. She reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the silver pen the attorney had left on the table. The narrow hallway was dead silent. The faint, distant cheering of the graduation crowds outside the arena felt like it belonged to another planet. Patricia leaned over the catering table. She pressed the tip of the luxury pen to the heavy stock paper. The sharp scratching sound of ink transferring to the page echoed off the concrete walls. It was the only sound in the corridor. It was the sound of a high society identity shattering into dust. She signed her full legal name on the resignation agreement. She flipped to the second page and signed the promissory note, legally transferring the $14,000 of fraudulent credit card debt back into her own name. She set the pen down. It rolled slightly across the stainless steel surface, stopping against the edge of my evidence dossier. The attorney stepped forward, picking up the signed documents. He reviewed the signatures, quickly nodding in satisfaction. He slid the papers into his dark leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. "The transaction is complete," the attorney announced. He turned to Helen and offered another respectful bow. "Madam, my firm remains at your disposal." Helen nodded graciously. "Thank you for your swift assistance," she replied. Patricia stood by the catering table, her arms hanging limply at her sides. She looked at the empty space where her resignation letter had been, her mind struggling to process the speed of her downfall. She had arrived at the graduation ceremony as an elite corporate director. She was leaving as an unemployed, disgraced fraud drowning in unsecured debt. She turned her hollow gaze toward the heavy metal exit doors at the end of the corridor. The pathway leading out to the parking lot represented her long, humiliating retreat back to a Bethesda home she would inevitably lose. I watched my parents and my brother absorb the reality of their new existence. The immediate corporate execution was finished, but the natural collapse of their lifestyle was only just beginning. The dominoes had been tipped, and there was nothing they could do to stop the chain reaction. 6 months passed since the concrete hallway at the university arena. The transition from summer to autumn brought a crisp chill to the Maryland air. My phone remained silent. The family group text, once a constant stream of demands for password resets and mundane complaints, sat buried at the bottom of my message inbox. I didn't block their numbers immediately. I simply muted the notifications, allowing the profound silence to serve as the final metric of our relationship. They only ever reached out when they required a service. Without a draft horse to pull their wagon, they had nothing left to say to me. The collapse of the Vance family facade didn't happen in a single dramatic explosion. It occurred exactly how a poorly written algorithm crashes. The errors compounded, the memory leaked, and the system slowly ground to an agonizing halt. Patricia losing her executive salary was the initial critical failure. She had signed the promissory note, absorbing the $14,000 credit card debt back into her own name. Without her monthly corporate income, that high-interest debt acted as a heavy anchor dropped from a sinking ship. Richard possessed a modest retirement pension, but it was a fraction of what they required to sustain their Potomac illusions. For years, they had operated on the assumption that Patricia's upward trajectory would outpace their reckless spending. They were carrying 2 underwater mortgages on a sprawling brick estate they couldn't afford to heat, let alone pay off. The bank sent the first notice of default within 60 days. The secondary failures materialized in the social sphere. The Potomac Country Club requires annual dues paid in full by the end of August. Patricia had always treated her membership as a vital organ, a necessary biological function for her survival among the elite. It was the staging ground for her networking, the place where she projected her curated success. When the payment deadline passed, and her accounts failed to clear the balance, the club administration quietly deactivated her gate code. She couldn't host her Sunday brunches on the manicured terraces. She couldn't mingle with the spouses of local politicians, trading hollow compliments over expensive mimosa pitchers. The severed access represented the first visible crack in her armor, a public downgrade she couldn't hide behind a designer handbag. The most humiliating public spectacle belonged to Derek. The golden child had structured his entire identity around the illusion of entrepreneurial success. His least imported sports car served as the physical proof of a thriving consulting agency that never actually existed. Because Patricia couldn't subsidize his monthly lease payments anymore, the automotive financing company initiated standard recovery protocols. It happened on a bright Tuesday afternoon in late September. A flatbed tow truck pulled into the circular driveway of the Bethesda estate. The recovery agent didn't knock on the door or ask for permission. He simply hooked the steel winch to the front axle of the vehicle and dragged it onto the ramp. Several neighbors' individuals Patricia had spent a decade trying to impress stood on their pristine lawns and watched the scene unfold in broad daylight. Derek stood on the front porch watching his ultimate status symbol roll away, possessing zero capital to stop the repossession. His fake title as a chief executive officer offered no protection against a breached contract. By November, the bank finalized the foreclosure proceedings on the Bethesda house. Patricia and Richard were forced to vacate the premises before the county sheriff arrived to physically change the locks. They packed a fraction of their designer furniture into a rented moving truck. Derek, out of options and dried-up funding, packed his bags and went with them. The sprawling estate with the custom kitchen and the vaulted ceilings was replaced by a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a significantly less prestigious zip code. The new neighborhood lacked gated entryways and manicured golf courses. The walls of their new unit were thin, and the floors were covered in cheap linoleum. It was a functional working-class area filled with people who earned honest wages. The sheer irony was inescapable. Patricia had spent her entire adult life running away from the blue-collar reality of Baltimore. She had sacrificed her moral compass and her relationship with her daughter to escape it, only to find herself deposited right back into the demographic she despised, stripped of the wealth she tried to steal. Richard spent his days sitting in a small living room staring out a window that overlooked an asphalt parking lot instead of a private garden. His lifelong strategy of passive avoidance had finally cornered him. He had allowed Patricia to steer their financial ship into the rocks, choosing the quiet comfort of complicity over the friction of doing the right thing. Now his pension went toward basic utilities and groceries, leaving no room for the luxuries he once took for granted. Patricia attempted to control the narrative one last time. Through the grapevine of mutual acquaintances, I learned she was framing her sudden exit from the defense contracting firm as an early retirement. She told former colleagues she wanted to downsize and focus on a simpler, stress-free life. She tried to spin the apartment as a minimalist choice. But the affluent enclaves of Maryland possess a very long, very unforgiving memory. Social climbing requires projecting an aura of invulnerability. In those circles, weakness is treated like a contagion. Public records are easily searchable. The foreclosure filings, the sudden lapse in country club dues, and the abrupt corporate resignation told a different story. Her former high society friends stopped returning her calls. The prestigious invitations to charity galas ceased. The elite circles protected their own borders with ruthless efficiency, and Patricia no longer held the correct passport to enter. I observed this natural deterioration from a strict, guarded distance. I started my new position as a software engineer, building a genuine career based on merit and verifiable skill. My days were filled with writing clean code and analyzing threat vectors. I didn't experience a triumphant thrill watching my family fall apart. I didn't send a text message to gloat over their misfortune or point out the poetry of their circumstances. I maintained a permanent, impenetrable perimeter of no contact. Vengeance requires emotional investment, and I had already closed their accounts. I understood that true healing demands vast amounts of empty space. You can't recover from a lifetime of manipulation if you continue to walk back into the same compromised environment. The people who treat you like a utility will never suddenly recognize your humanity just because their circumstances change. I refused to return to a room where my worth was measured solely by my capacity to carry someone else's burden. I had navigated the social engineering attacks, identified the structural weaknesses, and safely extracted myself from the collapsing network. I had built a new, secure foundation for my own life, and I left the sinking ship to the architects who designed it. My new reality began taking shape on a crisp Tuesday morning in early spring. The defense contracting firm assigned me a spacious corner desk on the 8th floor of their Arlington headquarters. I spent my days analyzing digital threat vectors and building robust firewalls for classified government networks. My daily routine involved identifying vulnerabilities and sealing them shut before an external entity could exploit the system. I found a deep, resonant satisfaction in the architecture of cybersecurity. The logic of the code felt clean and dependable. A network either allows unauthorized access or it denies the intrusion entirely. There is no emotional manipulation hidden inside a server protocol. The boundaries are fixed, mathematical, and unyielding. I applied that exact same logic to my personal life. I maintained my perimeter without guilt or hesitation. I earned a substantial salary based on my actual skills, proving to myself that my competence belonged to me alone, rather than serving as a free utility for negligent parents. When the first fiscal quarter ended, the corporate attorney from Victor Caldwell's office requested a brief meeting. He handed me a thick paper envelope containing the initial dividend yield from the irrevocable trust. The 35% equity stake my grandmother held generated a return that bypassed any need for traditional financing. I did not purchase a luxury sports car. I did not buy a sprawling brick estate in Potomac to impress strangers at a pretentious country club. I took the funds and began searching for a very specific type of architecture. I found the property in a quiet, unassuming suburb in Howard County, nestled between a grove of old oak trees and a slow-moving creek. It was a single-story craftsman home, chosen specifically so Helen would never have to navigate a steep staircase with her aching knees. The exterior featured a wide, sturdy wraparound porch constructed from weathered cedar. The neighborhood lacked heavy iron gates and restrictive homeowner associations. The people who lived nearby drove practical sedans, mowed their own lawns on Saturday mornings, and waved without expecting a favor in return. I signed the closing documents using a luxury fountain pen the attorney gifted me, and I transferred the title into a joint deed bearing both of our names. Moving Helen out of her Baltimore row house took less than an afternoon. She brought very little with her, choosing to leave the harsh memories of the night shift behind in the narrow brick corridor. Her transformation in the new suburban environment unfolded gradually like a perennial blooming after a long, bitter freeze. For the first 2 decades of my existence, I only ever watched my grandmother work to survive. I watched her haul industrial yellow mop buckets across slick linoleum floors. I watched her scrub commercial baseboards until her joints swelled and her back ached. Her calloused hands had always served as instruments of labor, performing the invisible tasks that kept other people comfortable while she remained hidden in the background. Now those same hands dug into the soft, dark soil of her own backyard for the pure pleasure of creation. She spent her afternoons tending to a sprawling garden she designed herself. She planted vibrant blue hydrangeas along the wooden fence line and cultivated sweet heirloom tomatoes in raised cedar beds. I would stand by the kitchen window drinking a glass of water, watching her kneel in the dirt under the warm Maryland sun. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat and a pair of worn canvas overalls. She looked peaceful. The frantic, exhausting rhythm of poverty had finally exited her bones, replaced by the slow, deliberate pace of a woman who owned her time. On a Sunday evening in late May, the air felt warm and fragrant with the scent of blooming jasmine. I walked out onto the cedar wraparound porch carrying a wooden serving tray. I set it down on the small wicker table positioned between 2 deep rocking chairs. Helen sat in the chair closest to the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of bruised purple and bright tangerine. I handed her a delicate bone china teacup filled with hot chamomile. The porcelain was fragile, decorated with a tiny, intricate pattern of blue songbirds. My mother used to lock cups exactly like this one inside a glass display cabinet, reserving them only for elite guests who might advance her social standing. Patricia would have never allowed a retired cleaning lady to hold such a delicate, expensive object. Helen took the cup. She held the fragile china between her rough, weathered fingers. The visual contrast was beautiful. She brought the rim to her lips, took a slow sip, and let out a quiet sigh of contentment. She did not have to hide in a restaurant alcove. She did not have to shrink into the shadows to protect someone else's fragile ego. She sat right out in the open air, visible to the entire neighborhood, safe and unhidden on a porch she owned. She looked at me over the rim of the cup, offering that same knowing, unbothered smile she had displayed at the graduation dinner. The war was over, and we were the only ones left sitting at the table. I took my own cup and sat down in the rocking chair beside her. I leaned back, listening to the gentle creak of the wooden floorboards and the distant chirp of the evening crickets. My life is quiet now, and I protect that quiet with everything I have. If you have walked this far with me, I want you to remember the fundamental truth about the people who demand your endless sacrifice. You cannot fix a toxic dynamic by working harder. You cannot buy respect from individuals who view your competence as a commodity to be traded. I spent 22 years trying to earn my place in a family that only valued my ability to shoulder their burdens and fund their illusions. Listen to me carefully. Any love that hands you an invoice is not love. It is rent. And you never have to pay rent to your own blood. If you are the drafted workhorse of your family, if you are the one keeping the digital and emotional ledgers balanced while everyone else takes the credit, put the burden down. Walk away from the people who keep you hidden and go find the ones who want to sit with you on the porch. If this story resonated with you, if you know what it feels like to finally stop paying for someone else's peace, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with anyone who needs permission to build their own perimeter. Tell me in the comments what boundary you are setting today. I read every single one, and I will be waiting for you in the next video. I stood up, collected the empty china cups, and carried the wooden tray back inside the house. I pulled the heavy front door shut. I reached out, grabbed the brass latch, and turned it. The heavy metallic click of the deadbolt locking echoed into the quiet night.
Every family is an architecture of invisible choices. From the outside, we see the polished brick, the manicured lawns, and the carefully curated holiday photographs that define the modern American dream. We see the gleaming vehicles parked in suburban driveways and the forced, brilliant smiles captured in country club newsletters. But inside, behind the heavy mahogany doors of affluent neighborhoods, the true foundation of a family is built on something far less tangible. It is built on the values we pass down, the honesty we practice, and the emotional awareness we cultivate. When we look back at the story of Kendra Vance, her mother Patricia, and her grandmother Helen, we are not just looking at a dramatic tale of corporate sabotage and hidden wealth. We are looking into a mirror. Through the lens of spiritual mindfulness and profound awakening, this narrative serves as a living, breathing testament to the perils of losing oneself in the modern pursuit of status. It is a cautionary tale for parents navigating a society that often pushes us into a fever dream of vanity. To raise children with integrity in today's world, we must turn our gaze inward. We must step away from the noise and cultivate 3 core roots of human development: moral integrity, emotional wisdom, and resilient grit. Modern American society, particularly in enclaves that worship prestige and material success, often orchestrates a dangerous bait and switch. We are taught to confuse a person's intrinsic human value with their social labels. We begin to believe that our worth is inextricably tied to our zip code, our job title, or the brand of the coat we wear to the winter gala. Parents like Patricia and Richard are tragic victims of this profound ignorance. They became trapped in an exhausting cycle of clinging to a hollow shell. They used luxury vehicles, exclusive memberships, and elite corporate connections, not as tools for living, but as armor to conceal their own inner emptiness and insecurity. When parents chase the external validation of the world, they forfeit their internal peace. They become haunted by the constant, exhausting fear of being exposed as ordinary. More devastatingly, this illusion corrupts the very nature of parental love. In a home governed by status, family bonds mutate into transactional contracts. Children are no longer seen as individual souls to be nurtured. They are reduced to utilities. They either become a resource to be exploited like Kendra, who was drained of her time and financial identity to maintain the family's facade, or they become ornamental trophies like Derek, who was funded blindly to project an image of generational success. The message here is stark and undeniable. Material wealth and social fame are terrible places to seek refuge. When you build your life and your family on a foundation of pretense and the quiet exploitation of others, that sandcastle will eventually collapse under the unforgiving tide of cause and effect. The true moral integrity of a parent is never measured by the size of the trust fund they leave behind, nor by the prestige of the universities their children attend. It is measured entirely by how they nurture a child's capacity for goodness, fairness, and genuine connection within a traditional family structure. To achieve this, we must stop weaponizing our affection. The love a parent gives a child must be a pure, unconditional offering. It should never be an invoice demanding future repayment, nor a ledger keeping track of sacrifices. When a child feels that their worth is tethered only to their usefulness, the home ceases to be a sanctuary and becomes a workplace. They learn to perform rather than to live. Furthermore, true moral integrity requires us to respect our roots. Patricia's vicious rejection of her own mother, a woman who spent her life executing grueling, honest labor to keep her family afloat, is a profound moral decay. True ethics involve the ability to honor honest work and express deep gratitude for silent sacrifices. As parents, the most vital lesson we can impart is that respect is never determined by a corporate job title or the price tag on a dress. It is determined by character. Helen's calloused hands held more honor than Patricia's manicured ones ever could. If we teach our children to turn their backs on where they came from in the name of upward mobility, we condemn them to wander through life without a moral compass. Wisdom is not the cunning ability to manipulate a situation to your advantage. It is the profound capacity to see the fundamental truth of people and circumstances, stripping away the illusions of the ego. Helen, the quiet matriarch of this story, possessed a deep, unshakable wisdom. She understood that money is merely a magnifying glass for character, not a metric of human value. Wisdom helps parents realize that forcing a child into a fabricated mold of success does not elevate them. It pushes them into a dark abyss of delusion. Helen watched her daughter equate power with cruelty, and she knew that handing over a financial empire to someone lacking emotional awareness would only result in total destruction. This brings us to the inescapable reality of cause and effect. If you plant seeds of deceit, exploitation, and narcissism in your family garden, the harvest will inevitably be bitter isolation and fractured bonds. Cultivating emotional wisdom means looking honestly at our own behaviors. It requires parents to understand that every narcissistic demand, every unfair expectation, and every attempt to control a child will reap a corresponding consequence. You cannot hack the human heart. You cannot socially engineer genuine love. Resilience, the quiet, enduring grit to face adversity and live authentically, is the final pillar of a healthy family. True parental guidance involves teaching children the power of self-reliance. Instead of blindly shielding children from consequence and overindulging them, creating a fragile, dependent existence, like Derek's parents must foster the strength to overcome challenges with clean hands. Kendra built her life through grueling shifts at a help desk and unwavering academic focus. She learned to stand on her own 2 feet, and that fierce independence became her ultimate armor against manipulation. We must allow our children to struggle to work and to build their own roofs so they never have to compromise their dignity to seek shelter. But grit is not just for the children. It requires an immense amount of courage for parents to let go of their egos. It takes profound strength to admit a mistake, to drop the mask of the perfect family, and to live a life of honest simplicity. It takes true bravery to look at your child and apologize for the times your own insecurities clouded your judgment. Parenting is ultimately an inside job. The repair of a fractured family always begins by turning inward. If we use our wisdom to discern right from wrong, our moral integrity to treat our loved ones with sincere fairness, and our grit to live independently of society's shallow judgments, we can build something beautiful. We can create a peaceful, traditional home where our children never feel the need to build cold, defensive firewalls against their own flesh and blood. If this reflection on family truth and the boundaries we draw resonates with your own journey, we invite you to join our community. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on what true family responsibility means to you, and be sure to subscribe to Fluffy Revenge for more stories that explore the quiet power of standing up for your peace. We spend our entire lives constructing the idea of a family. We build the walls, we paint the rooms, and we arrange the furniture to present a flawless picture to the world outside. But when the lights go out and the guests go home, the picture fades. You are left standing in the quiet hallway of your own choices. As you reach out to turn the lock on your own front door tonight, listen closely to the heavy metallic sound it makes. Ask yourself in the echoing silence that follows, what exactly are you locking out, and who truly is trapped inside with you?